Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are opening up the personal diary of the missionary David Brainerd. We're going to try to get a real look at the man behind the mission, using his own words to guide us.
So, the big question we're tackling is this. What was really going on inside David Brainerd? His diary shows this incredibly intense, almost constant internal battle. We're going to see straight from his pen how he dealt with this spiritual conflict.
To get our bearings, the period we're really zeroing in on starts around April 1743. This is when Brainerd is just kicking off his mission at Kaunaumeek. He's just turned 25, and he won't be ordained for another year. It's so key to remember, he's a very, very young man through all of this.
Yeah, and Brainerd's diary, it just lays bare this deep internal conflict that really shaped his entire ministry. And we're not just talking about him having a bad day here and there. This was a constant war raging inside him, a battle between his crushing sense of unworthiness and the spiritual duties he believed he was called to.
To really get a handle on his struggle, you have to start with the language he uses. Brainerd had this very specific, very powerful vocabulary to describe his own spiritual pain. You know, his anguish wasn't just some vague sadness. It fell into these clear, repeating categories. He wrote all the time about an overwhelming sense of unworthiness, real shame over his past sins, a feeling of total deadness in his ministry, and just these intense feelings of guilt. For him, these weren't just passing moods, they were his spiritual reality.
For instance, just listen to this. This is a direct quote from his diary. He wrote that he saw himself as the meanest, vilest, most helpless, guilty, ignorant, benighted creature living. The raw intensity of how he saw himself is just startling.
And it gets even more stark. He even wrote that his sense of inner corruption was so huge that he felt he was, quote, too bad to walk on God's earth. I mean, think about that. This wasn't just a spiritual feeling, it affected how he viewed his own physical existence.
So you can imagine how this internal state just hammered his confidence as a minister. He was terrified that his own spiritual lifelessness was actually hurting the people he was preaching to. He even felt guilty of what he called soul murder. Okay, so how in the world did he respond to this constant anguish? Well, Brainerd's suffering became the very fuel for an equally intense spiritual discipline. He didn't just sit in his misery, he fought back hard.
And let's not forget this number. All of these intense spiritual exercises, this entire inner war, was being fought by a man who was only 26 years old. 26.
His response to all this inner turmoil was anything but random. It was highly structured. He started by just acknowledging his need for holiness. From there, he would set apart entire days just for fasting and prayer. And then, he practiced what he called a careful improvement of time.
Here it is in his own words. He was convinced that meticulously managing every single hour and filling it with something useful was one of the best ways to find some spiritual stability and peace. But of course, this structured discipline created another tension in his life. It was this constant pull between his public duties as a missionary and what he felt was a desperate, personal need for private devotion.
And you can see the stark contrast right here. For Brainerd, solitude was where he could really pray and fast and grow. It was his refuge. Public life, on the other hand, often just led to confusion, spiritual dryness, and what he called unprofitable talk. He basically saw it as getting in the way of his spiritual life.
And he valued this alone time so much that he took some very practical steps to get it. His diary talks about how he undertook long and hard labor with his own two hands to build a little cottage for himself way out in the wilderness, just so he could be alone. And this quote really sums up his whole take on it. He knew that solitude had its own set of trials, for sure, but he firmly believed it was, quote, better to be alone than encumbered with noise and tumult.
But, and this is a really big but, Brainerd's diary isn't just a record of misery, not at all. Amidst all that struggle, he also writes about these very clear moments of divine help and real comfort.
And these moments of grace came in a few different forms. He talks about relief, about being able to just resign himself to God's will, and about a renewed spiritual fire. In these entries, he was recording what he absolutely felt was God stepping in and lifting his burdens.
So what did this relief actually look like? Well, he describes a sweetness and a freedom in his prayer life, an unusual fire when he preached, a real sense of peace with God's will, feelings of goodwill toward literally everyone, and a fresh confidence in God's abilities.
And this help from God directly changed his ministry. I mean, he goes from feeling like a soul murderer to, in his own words, speaking with so much freedom and having so much to say that he just didn't know how to stop. What a change.
This next entry is really something else. During these moments of grace, he felt such a universal benevolence that it even stretched to his enemies. He says it was refreshing to think about meeting them in heaven. That shows a genuine change of heart.
So when you step back and look at his spiritual life, you see this very clear cycle. It would start with this crushing awareness of his own sinfulness that would then drive him to this rigorous discipline, which in turn would lead him to a place of complete reliance on God for any kind of help.
And looking at this whole cycle, the extreme lows and the incredible highs, it really leaves us with a pretty big question. What can we learn today from a life of such intense devotion and struggle?